Somewhere beneath the shifting sands of Egypt, there is a silence so ancient it has its own weight. You can feel it the moment you step close enough to those enormous stones. That unmistakable sensation that you are standing at the edge of something you were never supposed to fully understand. Scholars have spent their entire lives measuring, cataloging, arguing, and still the pyramids refuse to give up their deepest secret. Not how they were built, not who built them, but why, truly, deeply, fundamentally why they were built at all. Because the answer the textbooks give you, the one about tombs and pharaohs and the afterlife, has never quite fit the structure of the evidence. The proportions are too precise, the alignments too deliberate, the mathematics too advanced. Yeah, and then when you begin to pull on that single loose thread, the thread that whispers that these structures were not built for the dead, but for the living, specifically for a future generation of survivors trying to rebuild after everything had fallen apart, the entire fabric of conventional history begins to unravel in the most beautiful and terrifying way imaginable. This is the story of that thread, and once you hear it, you will never look at those three great monuments on the Giza Plateau the same way again. We are taught that human civilization began approximately 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and more or less simultaneously in the Nile Valley of Egypt. We are told that before this point, humanity was a scattered collection of hunter-gatherers, nomadic tribes wandering the earth with no writing, no mathematics, no architecture of note. The story is clean and linear. Primitive beginnings, slow progression, eventual complexity. It is the story most of us absorbed without question. But the geological record does not cooperate with this story. The archaeological record does not cooperate with this story. And increasingly, researchers working at the fringes of mainstream academia, and a growing number well within it, are finding evidence that this neat timeline has a gaping hole in it. A hole shaped roughly like an entire civilization, or perhaps more than one. Consider what the last glacial maximum looked like. Approximately 20,000 years ago, sea levels were more than 300 feet lower than they are today. Yes, the coastlines of every continent were dramatically different. Vast stretches of land that are now submerged beneath shallow tropical seas were, at that time, fertile, habitable territory. The Persian Gulf was largely dry land. The area now known as Sundaland, the submerged continental shelf of Southeast Asia, was an enormous landmass twice the size of India. The coasts of the Americas, Africa, and Europe extended far beyond their current boundaries. If any technologically sophisticated civilization had existed during that period and built its greatest achievements near the coast, as virtually every advanced human culture tends to do, those achievements would now be sitting underwater, hidden, inaccessible, silent. The deglaciation period that followed was not a gentle, gradual warming. Modern climate science has revealed that it was punctuated by catastrophic episodes of rapid change. Approximately 12,900 years ago, an event so dramatic it has earned its own name, the Younger Dryas Impact Event, or the Dryas Cooling, appears to have caused near instantaneous climatic disruption across large portions of the northern hemisphere. The evidence for this event, discovered in ice cores, marine sediments, and a layer of microscopic diamond dust and nanodiamonds found in soil strata across 4 continents, suggests an impact or series of impacts from a fragmented comet that triggered catastrophic fires, floods, and a sudden temperature drop of up to 15 degrees Celsius in some regions, in as little as a decade. For any civilization that existed at that time, such an event would have been, in every sense of the word, apocalyptic. It would have looked, from the ground, exactly like the end of the world. And then, approximately 11,500 years ago, the Younger Dryas ended just as abruptly as it began. Temperatures spiked upward. The great ice sheets collapsed. Sea levels rose, in some periods, by as much as several feet per century. Rivers swelled and flooded. The landscape of the entire planet reorganized itself within a geological blink. If there were survivors of whatever came before, they would have found themselves in a world that had been remade almost beyond recognition. Their cities would have been drowned. Their libraries would have been burned or flooded. Their agricultural lands would have been buried under hundreds of feet of sediment or ocean water. They would have been, and in every practical sense, starting over. And here is the question that will not let go of certain researchers, certain geologists, certain archaeoastronomers, certain scholars who lie awake at night staring at the ceiling. What would survivors of such a catastrophe do? What would they build, and what would they encode into what they built, if they understood that everything they had known was gone, and that the next generation of complex human civilization might not arise for thousands of years? What would you build if you needed to leave a message for the future, but you had no guarantee that the future would speak your language, share your symbols, or understand your writing? You would build something permanent, something so enormous it could not be overlooked or destroyed by anything short of another planetary catastrophe. Instead, you would build something encoded with the universal language, mathematics, astronomy, geometry, the kind of knowledge that does not require translation because it is embedded in the structure of reality itself. You would build, in other words, something exactly like the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Great Pyramid was completed, according to mainstream Egyptology, approximately 4,500 years ago during the reign of the pharaoh Khufu. It stands 481 feet tall, or at least it did before the outer casing stones were stripped away in the medieval period to build mosques in Cairo. It contains an estimated 2.5 million stone blocks, some weighing as much as 80 tons. For most of human history, the dominant question about it was simply this: how? How did ancient Egyptians, without the wheel, without cranes, without steel, without any of the mechanical advantages we associate with large-scale construction, manage to lift, transport, and place millions of tons of stone with a precision that modern engineers still struggle to replicate? But there is a second set of questions, quieter, stranger, and in many ways more disturbing, that surrounds not the construction of the pyramid, but the measurements encoded within it. And these questions do not ask how, they ask why anyone in the ancient world would have known these things at all. The perimeter of the base of the Great Pyramid, divided by twice its height, gives a figure that equals pi to 4 significant digits. This is not approximate. This is not coincidence adjacent. Yet the ratio is accurate to the same precision that the ancient Egyptians would have needed to deliberately encode it. The building, if you measure it correctly, is a mathematical statement about the relationship between a circle's circumference and its diameter, rendered in stone on a scale visible from orbit. The height of the pyramid times 1 billion gives, within a margin of less than 1%, the average distance from the Earth to the Sun in kilometers. The speed of light in meters per second, when divided by the geographic coordinate of the Great Pyramid's latitude, 29.979 degrees north, gives a number so close to the actual speed of light that the discrepancy falls within the margin of error of modern measurement techniques. The pyramid's base is aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a degree, more precise than the Paris Observatory, which was itself considered a marvel of modern engineering when it was constructed in the 17th century. The ratio of the pyramid's height to its base perimeter equals exactly the ratio of the Earth's polar radius to its equatorial circumference. In other words, the Great Pyramid is, in its proportions, a scale model of the Northern Hemisphere, accurate enough to have been used to calculate the precise size of the Earth, a calculation that the ancient Greeks, using cruder methods, would not accomplish for another 2,000 years. Let that settle for a moment. Then ask yourself, who taught the ancient Egyptians these things? Yes, the conventional answer is that the Egyptians figured these things out themselves, organically, through careful observation and accumulated practical knowledge. And perhaps they did. But the striking feature of the pyramid's encoded mathematics is not merely that the Egyptians possessed this knowledge, it is that they chose to encode it in a structure designed to last forever. The pyramid was not a classroom or a library in any conventional sense. It was not a place where you could walk in, sit down, and read the calculations on the wall. The mathematics is embedded in the dimensions of the structure itself, invisible unless you already know to look for it and already possess the tools to measure it accurately. It is, in other words, mathematics hidden in plain sight, preserved, waiting for someone who could understand it. And if you hold that thought, if you allow yourself to sit with the possibility that the pyramid's mathematics was not a byproduct of its construction, but its primary purpose, then the entire building reframes itself. It is no longer a tomb. It is a transmission, a message in the most durable medium available. Stone, shaped and placed by hands that understood things they should not have understood, in a configuration designed to endure until the civilization capable of decoding it had finally arrived. Inside the Great Pyramid, there are several passages and chambers whose orientations have puzzled scholars for generations. Two small shafts, roughly 9 inches square, extend from the king's chamber diagonally through the body of the pyramid toward the exterior. For much of modern history, these shafts were assumed to be ventilation channels, a practical solution to the problem of stale air in deep interior spaces. But the ventilation explanation has always been uncomfortable because the shafts are sealed at both ends and do not actually reach the exterior of the pyramid in a way that would allow meaningful air circulation. Something else was going on. Astronomer Robert Bauval, working in the 1980s and early 90s, proposed what has become one of the most debated and, in certain circles, most convincing explanations for the shafts. His investigation began with a question about the stars. The northern shaft of the king's chamber, he calculated, was aligned with the star Thuban, the pole star of the ancient Egyptian period. But the southern shaft pointed toward the belt of Orion, and specifically toward the star Alnitak, the lowest of the 3 stars in Orion's belt, at a declination that corresponded not to the sky of 4,500 years ago, but to the sky of approximately 10,500 years ago. Bauval extended this observation. The 3 pyramids of the Giza Plateau, Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure, are not arranged in a straight line. They are arranged in a slightly offset pattern that precisely mirrors the 3 stars of Orion's belt, including the slight angular offset of the smallest star from the line connecting the other 2. The match is not approximate, it is exact. And when you calculate the astronomical precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the positions of stars to shift gradually over thousands of years, The layout of the three Giza pyramids corresponds most perfectly to the position of Orion's belt as it appeared in the sky in approximately 10,500 years before the Common Era. 10,500 years before the Common Era. That is not a date in ancient Egyptian history. That is a date that falls squarely within the post-Younger Dryas period. The period immediately following the catastrophic climate events that, according to the geological record, radically disrupted human civilization and sea levels across the planet. The period, in other words, when survivors of whatever came before might have been doing exactly what a frightened and knowledgeable remnant of a destroyed civilization would do, building something permanent, something encoded with their most essential knowledge, something designed to endure until the future was ready to receive it. The ancient Egyptians called Orion by the name Sa, and they associated it closely with the god Osiris, the god of death, resurrection, and the afterlife. This association is usually interpreted as mythology, as religious symbolism. But consider it from a different angle. What if the Orion alignment was not symbolism, but cartography? What if the builders of the pyramid wanted to tell future astronomers the precise historical moment when the project was conceived? Not when the stones were laid, but when the plan was formed. When the knowledge that would be encoded in the pyramid was first assembled, and by aligning the structure to the sky of 10,500 years before the Common Era, the builders effectively left a timestamp. A date. An astronomical fingerprint that no flood, no fire, no passage of centuries could erase. Because it is written not in a language, but in the mathematics of celestial mechanics, which does not change and cannot be mistranslated. If this interpretation is correct, then the Great Pyramid is announcing, in the clearest possible terms available to its builders, that it encodes knowledge from a period more than 6,000 years before it was physically constructed. It is not the product of the civilization that built it. It is the legacy of a civilization that was already gone. A short distance from the Great Pyramid, the Great Sphinx crouches in the sand with an expression of permanent, yet patient waiting. It has been waiting for a very long time. Exactly how long is, in mainstream Egyptology, a settled question. The Sphinx was built during the reign of the pharaoh Khafra, approximately 4,500 years ago, at roughly the same time as the second of the three Great Giza pyramids. Geologist Robert Schoch disagrees. He disagrees on the basis of the rocks. In the early 1990s, Schoch, a professor at Boston University with a specialization in the geological analysis of stone erosion, made a series of careful observations about the erosion patterns on the body of the Sphinx and, crucially, on the walls of the enclosure in which it sits. The pattern of erosion he found was not consistent with wind and sand erosion, which would produce horizontal striations at the base of the structure. Instead, the Sphinx enclosure walls showed deep, undulating vertical channels of erosion, the kind produced specifically by prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall, to water running down vertical stone faces over long periods of time. The problem with this observation is straightforward and devastating. The Giza Plateau has been an extremely arid desert for at least 3,500 years. For Schoch's erosion patterns to have formed, the Sphinx enclosure would need to have been exposed to heavy, sustained rainfall for an extended period, centuries, possibly millennia, before the desert conditions set in. The last time the Giza region experienced the kind of sustained precipitation needed to produce that level of water erosion was during a period known as the African Humid Period, which ended approximately 5,000 years ago at the earliest. But based on the depth and character of the erosion, Shok and his colleagues argue that the carving of the Sphinx must date to at least 7,000 years before the Common Era, and possibly as early as 10,000 years before the Common Era, when the region was lush, wet, and radically different from its current state. This single geological observation, peer-reviewed, replicable, and addressed by Shok in multiple academic publications, moves the construction of the Sphinx into a period well before the rise of ancient Egyptian civilization as conventionally understood. It places it, once again, in that same broad window of post-Younger Dryas reconstruction, at that same era of mysterious rebuilding that keeps appearing in the evidence like a recurring theme in a piece of music you cannot quite place. Mainstream Egyptologists have pushed back against Shok's conclusions vigorously, arguing for various alternative explanations of the erosion patterns. But none of those alternative explanations has been demonstrated to be physically plausible under the climatic conditions of the last 4,500 years. The debate continues, and in the meantime, the Sphinx continues to wait, weathered by rains that no living Egyptian ever saw fall, guarding a secret that may be older than we have ever dared to imagine. What was it guarding? What required a monument of that scale placed precisely there, oriented precisely as it is, in the full knowledge that the desert would eventually reclaim the surrounding landscape and bury everything nearby in sand, preserving the structure against everything except the most determined future excavation? There is something beneath the Giza Plateau. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed anomalies, cavities, and passages beneath the paws of the Sphinx, beneath and around the pyramid complex, that have not been fully explored or explained. Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities has been cautious about permitting excavations in these areas. The reasons for that caution are unclear, but the anomalies are real, documented, peer-reviewed. There is something down there, and whatever it is, it was placed there deliberately, in a location chosen because the desert would keep it safe for exactly as long as was needed. To understand why a pre-catastrophe civilization might have chosen Egypt as the location for its most important legacy project, you need to understand the geography of the world as it existed during the last glacial maximum and the early Holocene period. Because the world was, quite literally, a different planet. When sea levels were 300 feet lower than they are today, the Nile Valley was not an isolated river corridor cutting through desert. It was part of an extensive, interconnected network of fertile river systems that spanned much of what is now the eastern Mediterranean basin and the Red Sea corridor. The Red Sea was partially dry. The Persian Gulf was almost entirely dry. The entire continental shelf of North Africa, now submerged, was habitable land. A civilization centered in this region would have had access to an enormous, fertile, interconnected territory that simply does not exist today. More striking still is the situation in other parts of the world. The Black Sea, currently a large inland sea connected to the Mediterranean, was during the last glacial period a landlocked freshwater lake, considerably smaller than it is today, surrounded by lush grasslands and inhabited by large mammal populations. The catastrophic flooding of this lake, which occurred when the rising Mediterranean broke through what is now the Bosphorus Strait, approximately 7,600 years before the Common Era, has been proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman as the origin of the worldwide flood narratives found in virtually every human culture on Earth. the flood of Noah, and the Sumerian flood of Utnapishtim, the Hindu deluge of Manu, the Mesoamerican flood stories, the Australian Aboriginal accounts of the sea swallowing the coastal lands. These stories, distributed across every inhabited continent, share a striking structural similarity. A world-ending flood, a small group of survivors, and a sacred duty to preserve and transmit the knowledge of the world that was lost. Mythology scholars have long noted this global distribution of flood narratives, but the conventional explanation has been cultural diffusion. The stories spread from one origin point and were adapted by different cultures over time. But the mythologist Vine Deloria Jr. and others have argued persuasively that the geographical specificity of many of these stories, the references to specific local landmarks that are now underwater, yes, the accurate descriptions of coastlines that were submerged thousands of years ago, suggests that at least some of these narratives are genuine oral records of actual events witnessed by actual human beings whose descendants preserve the memory across dozens of generations. If this is correct, then humanity's mythological record is, in part, a fragmented oral library of pre-catastrophe knowledge. Stories and symbols encoded not in stone, but in the one medium more durable than stone. The human voice, passing knowledge from parent to child across 100 generations, deliberately, carefully, as an act of cultural preservation. And the monuments, the pyramids, the standing stones, the ancient temples aligned to specific astronomical events, might be the other half of that library, the physical half. Yet the part that was too complex and too mathematical to survive intact through oral transmission alone, and so required to be fixed in something permanent. The builders of the Great Pyramid, on this reading, were not the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty building tombs for their own glorification. They were the descendants, spiritual, if not necessarily biological, of a much older tradition of knowledge preservation, working from plans and specifications that had been passed down for thousands of years, finally able to execute the physical component of a project that had been planned long before the first stone was quarried at Aswan or Tura. Ancient cultures across the world, with no apparent direct contact with one another, they would develop sophisticated astronomical traditions that focused on the same handful of celestial phenomena: the precession of the equinoxes, the movements of the planets through the zodiac, the cyclical return of specific stars to specific positions in the sky, and the long-term mathematical cycles that govern the behavior of the solar system over periods of thousands and tens of thousands of years. The Mayan long count calendar, the Hindu Yuga cycle, the ancient Greek concept of the Great Year, the Egyptian concept of Zep Tepi, the first time, which refers to a primordial golden age when the gods walked on earth and established the patterns that the world was meant to follow forever after. What these traditions share, beneath their different cultural dressings, is an awareness of deep time, of cycles so long that a single human lifetime represents an almost invisibly small fraction of them, and an insistence on measuring, recording, and preserving information about these cycles with extraordinary precision. Why? Why would ancient cultures, in the midst of lives consumed by the immediate demands of agriculture, warfare, political organization, and survival, devote enormous intellectual and institutional resources to tracking astronomical cycles that would not complete themselves for another 26,000 years? The answer most commonly offered is religion. The stars were sacred. Astronomical knowledge was a form of divine communication, and this is certainly true as far as it goes. But religion and practical knowledge have never been as separate as modern Western culture tends to assume. The ancient priests who tracked the stars were not doing so purely out of metaphysical curiosity. They were doing so because astronomical knowledge was useful. It told you when to plant and when to harvest. It allowed you to navigate the open ocean. It gave you a framework for predicting seasons, floods, eclipses, and the behavior of the climate over long periods of time. And here is the deeper reason, the one that is whispered rather than stated plainly in the academic literature. Astronomical knowledge is a form of insurance against catastrophe. If you understand the long-term cycles of the solar system, if you know that certain alignments of planetary bodies correlate with periods of increased cosmic debris in Earth's orbital path, or that specific configurations of the sun and moon relate to tidal and seismic instability, or that the precession of the equinoxes marks the completion of a cycle after which climatic conditions tend to reset, then you possess, in principle, the ability to predict future catastrophes, not with certainty, but with enough advance warning to prepare, to document, to build something that will survive what is coming and carry essential knowledge through the darkness to the other side. The great astronomical monuments of the ancient world, Stonehenge, the pyramids, the Cambodian temple complex of Angkor Wat, whose major temples mirror the constellation Draco in a configuration corresponding to the sky of approximately 10,500 years before the Common Era, the Nazca lines of Peru, whose figures align with stellar positions in ways that are still being calculated. These structures are not monuments to mystical vagueness. They are precision instruments. And instruments are built for a purpose. If the purpose was navigation through deep time, if the builders needed to encode not just where they were, but when, so that future civilizations could locate themselves in the great astronomical cycle and understand what had come before, then the choice to encode this information in the positions and alignments of permanent stone structures makes not just symbolic but engineering sense. Stone endures. Astronomical alignments can be calculated backward through time with perfect mathematical precision. You cannot forge a stellar alignment. You cannot accidentally produce a structure whose dimensions encode the speed of light, the size of the Earth, and the distance to the sun. If it is there, it was put there. And if it was put there, someone wanted it found. In 1945, a collection of ancient texts was discovered near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi. In 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in caves near the ancient settlement of Qumran. Both discoveries revealed that the textual record of the ancient world was far richer and more diverse than the fragmentary materials that had survived through the formal channels of classical scholarship. And in both discoveries raised the haunting possibility that these fragments were themselves just fragments. That somewhere, in some form, the real library still existed. The Library of Alexandria, destroyed in a series of fires and military actions over several centuries around the beginning of the Common Era, is the most famous case of ancient knowledge lost to history. By some accounts, it held at its peak close to 500,000 scrolls, not merely Greek and Roman texts, but records collected from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, India, and beyond. When it burned, an immeasurable quantity of ancient knowledge disappeared from the accessible record of human civilization. What was in those scrolls? We do not fully know. We know that some of them contained advanced astronomical and mathematical knowledge, all because fragments of that knowledge survived in the works of scholars who had studied at Alexandria. But the bulk of the collection is simply gone. Or is it? The ancient Egyptian tradition of preserving important knowledge in underground chambers, the duat, the underworld beneath the Earth's surface, was not purely mythological. Archaeological evidence has confirmed the existence of extensive subterranean complexes beneath several major Egyptian temple sites. The most famous, largely unexplored, is the system of passages and chambers believed to lie beneath the Giza Plateau itself. References in ancient texts, including the works of classical-era writers like Herodotus and Iamblichus, speak of a hall of records, an underground repository of ancient knowledge said to have been built before the flood, in a time when the knowledge of an earlier civilization needed to be protected from the coming catastrophe. Edgar Cayce, the American psychic who became famous in the early 20th century for his trances and medical readings, spoke of this hall of records repeatedly, claiming it lay beneath the right paw of the Sphinx and contained the complete historical and scientific record of an advanced civilization he called Atlantis, which had sunk beneath the ocean approximately 10,500 years before the Common Era. This date, which Cayce stated in trances beginning in the 1920s, well before the development of modern geoarchaeology or climate science, corresponds with uncanny precision to the Younger Dryas boundary event now identified in the geological record. Whether you credit Cayce's source or not, the question of what lies beneath the Sphinx remains scientifically open. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1990s by a team led by researcher Thomas Dobecki detected significant anomalies beneath the Sphinx's paws. A rectangular cavity approximately 9 meters by 12 meters at a depth of approximately 5 meters. The Egyptian authorities did not permit excavation of this anomaly. The official explanation was that no excavation permit had been applied for in the proper manner. The unofficial explanation, whispered in the corridors of conferences and research institutions, is that the Egyptian government is deeply uncertain about what it might find, and deeply uncertain about what finding it would mean for the conventional narrative of ancient Egyptian history. And now, because if there is a library beneath the Sphinx, and if that library predates the pharaonic period by thousands of years, then everything we know about the origins of civilization needs to be reconsidered. The pyramids were not the beginning. They were the continuation. And the civilization that built them was not writing its own story. It was preserving someone else's. Let us try, for a moment, to think practically about what survival after civilizational collapse would actually look like. Not the romantic cinematic version of apocalypse survival, the lone warrior, the dramatic quest, the rebirth of hope against all odds, but the practical, human, organizational version. A group of people who knew, before the catastrophe, that something catastrophic was coming. A group that had the knowledge, the resources, and the institutional continuity to prepare. A group that understood their mission not as personal survival, but as custodial. Their duty was not to save themselves, but to save the knowledge. This is not a fantastical scenario. Human beings have always organized knowledge preservation in exactly this way. Monasteries in medieval Europe preserved classical learning through the Dark Ages, not because monks were magical, but because they were organized, dedicated, and willing to devote their lives to a long-term project whose benefits they knew they would not personally live to see. The great libraries of the Islamic Golden Age preserved Greek and Roman scientific knowledge that would have otherwise been permanently lost to European civilization. The oral traditions of indigenous cultures around the world have preserved geographical, ecological, and historical knowledge across hundreds of generations, with a fidelity that modern researchers have repeatedly confirmed by comparing oral records to archaeological and geological evidence. What if the tradition behind the pyramids was one of these preservation institutions? What if a group of survivors from a pre-catastrophe civilization, sufficiently advanced to possess a sophisticated understanding of astronomy, mathematics, geology, and engineering, organized themselves around the specific mission of preserving and transmitting their civilization's most essential knowledge, with the explicit understanding that the physical repository for that knowledge would need to be built somewhere geographically stable, mathematically legible, and permanent enough to survive another 10,000 years. The Giza Plateau is, geologically speaking, one of the most stable surfaces on the face of the Earth. It sits on a massive outcropping of granite and limestone that has not experienced significant seismic activity in recorded history. It is elevated enough above the Nile floodplain to have remained above sea level throughout the Holocene sea level rise. It is located at a geographic position, approximately 30 degrees north latitude. That places it close to the center of the world's habitable landmass, making it accessible from virtually every direction. And it is located at a longitude that corresponds, with striking precision, to the center of the Earth's land hemisphere. The hemisphere containing the largest proportion of the planet's total land area, calculated geometrically. In other words, if you were designing a location for the most important message in human history, and you wanted to ensure that it could be found and accessed by any sufficiently developed future civilization, regardless of which direction that civilization approached from, you would choose almost exactly the location where the pyramids were built. This is not coincidence. Or rather, it may be coincidence. But it is a coincidence that requires explanation. And the most parsimonious explanation, the one that requires the fewest additional assumptions to account for all the available evidence, is that the location was chosen deliberately by people who understood the mathematics of the Earth's surface, precisely because of these properties. If the pyramids are a message, what does the message say? And we have established that it encodes mathematical constants and astronomical alignments. We have established that it may be oriented to a specific historical moment more than 6,000 years before its physical construction. We have established that it occupies a geographically optimal location on the Earth's surface. But is there a content to the message beyond these structural features? Is there something the builders were trying to tell us, specifically, practically, that we have not yet fully decoded? The ancient Egyptian texts associated with the pyramid traditions, the pyramid texts, among the oldest written religious documents in the world, and carved into the walls of 5th and 6th dynasty pyramid chambers, speak repeatedly of two things: the resurrection of the dead king and his journey through the underworld to join the stars, and a primordial time before human history when divine beings called the Neteru walked the earth and established the patterns of civilization. This primordial time is Zep Tepi, the first time, and the purpose of the pharaonic rituals described in the pyramid texts is, in part, to return the world to the conditions of Zep Tepi, to restore the original order that existed before the disruption. This is usually read as religious metaphor. The dead king returns to the primordial state of divine order, uniting with Osiris and the stars. And certainly, the metaphor is there, but run beneath the metaphor is something that reads, on close examination, it less like mythology and more like a mission statement. The civilization that built the pyramids understood itself as existing in the aftermath of something, a disruption, a falling from grace, a departure from an original state of order and knowledge. Its most sacred rituals were oriented toward the recovery of that original state. Its most important monuments were aligned to the period when that original state existed. Its priests preserved and transmitted knowledge that they explicitly identified as having come from before their own time. The builders of the pyramids knew they were inheritors of a tradition older than themselves. They said so, clearly, in their own texts. And the physical evidence, the mathematics encoded in the structures, the geological age of the Sphinx, the astronomical alignments pointing to 10,500 years before the Common Era, suggests that they were telling the truth. The message, then, is not merely mathematical. It is historical. It is a claim about time, about a period when a civilization existed that understood things now lost, and about the responsibility of its inheritors to preserve and eventually recover that understanding. The pyramids are not just a data package. They are also a marker. Here is where we stood. Here is when we stood. Here is what we knew. Find this, and you will know that we existed. Find this, and you will know that knowledge survived the flood. Find this, and you will know where to look next. And when they say find this, perhaps what they mean is not just find the pyramid. Perhaps what they mean is find what the pyramid points to. Find the shaft alignments and trace them back to the sky of 10,500 years before the Common Era. Find the passage beneath the Sphinx and open it. Find the knowledge that the keepers of this tradition devoted their lives to protecting, generation after generation, in the faith that one day someone would come who was ready to receive it. We may be that someone. We may finally be that someone. Egypt is not alone. If the theory of a pre-catastrophe civilization and a deliberate knowledge preservation project is correct, you would expect to find evidence of it not just in Egypt, but wherever survivors of that civilization managed to reach, and wherever the local cultures they encountered were willing to accept and preserve the knowledge they brought. And this is precisely what the global evidence shows. In the highlands of southern Turkey, the site of Göbekli Tepe, excavated beginning in the 1990s by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, has been definitively dated to at least 11,500 years before the Common Era. That is not a misprint. 11,500 years. It is the oldest known megalithic structure on Earth by a margin of several thousand years, predating Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years, and predating the conventional beginning of Egyptian civilization by 6,500 years. And it is not primitive. It consists of large, T-shaped limestone pillars up to 18 feet tall and weighing up to 10 tons, arranged in circular enclosures and decorated with sophisticated bas-relief carvings of animals and abstract symbols. And the architectural planning and symbolic vocabulary evident at Göbekli Tepe is not what you would expect from a culture at the very beginning of the Neolithic period, barely emerging from the hunter-gatherer stage of development. Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement. No evidence of permanent habitation has been found there. It was a ceremonial site, a site for ritual, for gathering, for the transmission of knowledge and meaning, and it was deliberately buried around 10,000 years before the Common Era, under thousands of tons of rubble fill, in an act that archaeologists have described as intentional interment. The site was not abandoned. It was buried, carefully, completely, in a manner that would preserve the structures within it almost perfectly until they were ready to be rediscovered, buried like a seed, like a message placed in a vault and sealed against the day when it would finally be opened. The symbolism on the pillars of Göbekli Tepe has not been fully decoded, but researchers have identified what appears to be an astronomical record, a stone pillar known as the Vulture Stone, that depicts what several researchers interpret as a description of the Younger Dryas impact event itself, using animal figures to represent constellations and the positions of celestial bodies at the precise date of the impact. approximately 10,850 years before the Common Era. If this interpretation is correct, Göbekli Tepe was not just built near the time of the Great Catastrophe. It was built by people who remembered the catastrophe, who recorded it in stone, and who understood its astronomical context in a way that required sophisticated prior knowledge of the night sky and the movements of celestial bodies over long periods. Halfway around the world, in the limestone karst mountains of southern Bosnia, archaeologist Semir Osmanagic has proposed that a series of large, geometrically regular hills are in fact human-made pyramidal structures of enormous antiquity. The Bosnian Valley of the Pyramids remains deeply controversial in mainstream archaeology, with many scholars dismissing the pyramidal interpretation as projection of human meaning onto natural formations. But the presence of concrete-like artificial stone material, the discovery of tunnels beneath the hills, and radiocarbon dates on organic material within the tunnel system, suggesting human activity going back 15,000 years, have kept the debate alive and unresolved. In Mexico, the Great Pyramid Complex of Teotihuacan, a word that translates roughly as the city where men become gods, was already ancient and abandoned when the Aztecs discovered it several centuries before the Spanish conquest. The Aztecs did not know who had built it. They attributed its construction to divine beings. The astronomical alignments and mathematical proportions of Teotihuacan mirror those of the Giza complex in ways that have been noted by several researchers, not as proof of direct contact between ancient Egyptian and ancient Mesoamerican cultures, but as evidence of a shared mathematical and astronomical tradition whose ultimate origin may predate both. The pattern keeps repeating. Ancient structures of extraordinary precision and sophistication, built at approximately the same historical moment, encoding the same astronomical information, in locations distributed across the globe in a pattern that looks, to those willing to look, less like coincidence and more like a coordinated project. Any project of this scope, the deliberate, multi-generational preservation and transmission of complex mathematical, astronomical, and historical knowledge across a period of potentially thousands of years, would require an institution. Not a government, which rises and falls and changes its priorities. Not a university, which requires physical permanence and stability. Something more adaptable, something that could survive the collapse of one civilization and insert itself into the next. Something organized around secrecy, because the knowledge it preserved was too valuable and too dangerous to share indiscriminately, and because any institution that openly claimed to possess knowledge from before the flood would immediately attract the hostile attention of every political and religious authority in the area. There are traditions in almost every ancient culture of precisely such institutions. In Egypt, the mysteries of Isis and Osiris. In Greece, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Pythagorean brotherhood, the various schools of philosophy that trace their knowledge to Egyptian or Chaldean sources. In Mesopotamia, the guild-like orders of scribes and astronomers attached to the great temple complexes. It's in India, the Vedic lineages that claimed their most ancient texts descended from a period before recorded history. In the Americas, the keeper traditions of various indigenous cultures that explicitly describe themselves as preserving knowledge from a time before the flood. These traditions differ enormously in their surface forms, their myths, their rituals, their symbols, their organizational structures. But they share certain deep structural features that are difficult to explain except by reference to a common origin. They all possess an inner and an outer teaching, an exoteric version of their wisdom, accessible to outsiders, and a deeper esoteric version reserved for initiates who had been tested and trusted. They all emphasize the importance of mathematics and astronomy as foundations of all other knowledge, and as they all speak of a primordial golden age of divine knowledge from which the current world has fallen and to which it must eventually return. They all preserve specific astronomical knowledge, particularly knowledge related to the precession of the equinoxes and the long astronomical cycles, that serves no obvious practical purpose in a pre-industrial agricultural society, but makes perfect sense as a framework for understanding long-term civilizational cycles and predicting future catastrophes. In the medieval period, the traditions of the ancient mysteries resurfaced in new forms. The Hermetic philosophy of Renaissance Europe, with its explicit claims to transmit the wisdom of the ancient Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus. The operative and later speculative branches of Freemasonry, whose founding mythology explicitly involves the building of a great temple using sacred geometric principles transmitted from an ancient source. The Rosicrucian movement, which appeared in 17th century Europe, claiming access to a hidden library of ancient wisdom. Whether these movements possessed genuine ancient knowledge or were cultural reimaginings of older traditions is debated, but their consistent references to the same themes, ancient wisdom, catastrophic loss, sacred geometry, the duty to preserve and transmit, suggest that they were drawing from a common well. However distorted by time and transmission, their access to that well had become. What matters here is not whether any particular secret society or esoteric tradition actually possesses the knowledge of the pre-catastrophe civilization. What matters is that the pattern of organized, secretive, multi-generational knowledge preservation is a real and documented feature of human cultural history. We know that such institutions exist. We know that they can survive for extraordinary periods of time. We know that they encode their knowledge in multiple forms simultaneously: physical structures, symbolic systems, oral traditions, written texts, precisely because they understand that any single medium of preservation is vulnerable. The pyramids may be the most dramatic and durable component of a knowledge preservation strategy that also included texts, oral traditions, and institutional lineages now only partially recoverable. They were the stone component, but they were not the only component. Yet, and the fact that the stone component has survived intact, while much of the rest has been lost or fragmented, may itself be the most important message the builders left us. The architecture endures. The rest must be reconstructed from the architecture. We have traveled a long way from the conventional story of tomb-building pharaohs and divine funerary rites. We have passed through the geological evidence of catastrophic climate events, the mathematical precision of structures that should not exist, the astronomical alignments that point to a period 6,000 years before the pyramids were physically built, the water erosion on a sphinx that should have been built in a desert but was clearly built in a rainforest, the global distribution of flood myths and megalithic monuments, the invisible library beneath the paws of a stone lion, and the secret societies that may be the last institutional echoes of a civilization that the sea swallowed whole. You might reasonably ask, if all of this is true, why don't we know it? Why isn't this the mainstream account of ancient history? Why are these ideas on the margins rather than at the center of academic discourse? Part of the answer is institutional. Academic disciplines are organized around established narratives, and established narratives have enormous momentum. Careers are built on them. Funding flows to research that confirms them. The social and professional costs of challenging them are high, and the institutional rewards are low. Researchers who propose that the pyramids predate the Fourth Dynasty, or that the Sphinx is thousands of years older than currently believed, or that a sophisticated pre-catastrophe civilization existed, face not just intellectual criticism, but professional marginalization. This does not mean the mainstream consensus is wrong. It means the consensus has structural protections that have nothing to do with the evidence. Another part of the answer is that the evidence is genuinely difficult to evaluate. The geological claims are contested by geologists. The astronomical alignments are disputed by astronomers who argue for alternative interpretations. The mathematical encodings in the pyramid are challenged by scholars who argue that the measurements are selectively interpreted. None of these challenges is definitively wrong, and none of the alternative interpretations is definitively right. The evidence does not yet constitute proof. It constitutes a pattern, a coherent, consistent cross-disciplinary pattern that is more easily explained by the knowledge preservation hypothesis than by any alternative currently on the table. But pattern is not proof. An honest inquiry requires acknowledging the difference. And yet the underground anomalies beneath the Sphinx have not been excavated. The mathematical precision of the pyramid has not been fully explained. The water erosion on the Sphinx enclosure has not been accounted for under current climatic models. The Göbekli Tepe complex is real, and it is 11,500 years old, and it was built by people who knew things we do not yet understand. The global distribution of nearly identical flood narratives is real, and it is not fully explained by cultural diffusion. The astronomical timestamp built into the Giza layout is real, and it points to 10,500 years before the Common Era, and it does so with the precision of a deliberate signal. These are not fringe observations. These are documented features of the physical, geological, and textual record that any complete theory of ancient history must account for. And the theory that accounts for most of them, the theory whose explanatory reach is broader and whose required assumptions are fewer than any of its rivals, is the theory that something significant and sophisticated existed before the flood, that some of its knowledge survived the catastrophe, and that the pyramids are the most durable component of the effort to transmit that knowledge across the dark water of civilizational collapse to whatever civilization would eventually emerge on the other side. We emerged on the other side. We have been standing next to the message for 4,500 years, measuring its stones and debating the color of its original casing, and arguing about the logistics of the ramps that built it, while the message itself waits, patient as the Sphinx, for someone to stop measuring and start reading. There is a question that haunts this entire investigation, and it is not historical. It is not about the past. It is about us, right now, in the present, looking back at those enormous stones on the Giza Plateau and wondering, really wondering, in the full philosophical weight of the word, what it means that they are there. If the pyramids were built as a message, as a repository of essential knowledge intended to survive a catastrophe and provide the survivors of that catastrophe with the intellectual tools they needed to restart civilization, then the intended recipients of that message are not some distant future generation. They are us. We are the civilization that arose from the wreckage. We are the people who found the stones, measured them, argued about them, and slowly, haltingly, began to realize that they were saying something we did not expect. We are, in the most literal possible interpretation of this hypothesis, the people the pyramids were built for. And this changes the moral weight of the question. It is no longer purely academic, a matter of getting the dates right, of resolving a disciplinary dispute between geologists and Egyptologists, of establishing which dynasty built what and when. If the pyramids are a message from the founders of our intellectual tradition, then reading that message correctly is not an optional intellectual exercise. It is the completion of a project that began before civilization as we know it, a project whose purpose was to ensure that the knowledge necessary for civilization to survive and flourish would be available to the generation that needed it most. What knowledge? Mathematical relationships that describe the structure of the physical world, astronomical frameworks that situate humanity within the deep time of planetary and cosmic cycles, geometric principles that may encode, at scales we have not yet fully explored, practical knowledge about engineering, navigation, energy generation, or other technical domains, the historical records of a civilization whose achievements and, crucially, whose mistakes led to its destruction, records that might tell us not just what was possible before the flood, but what proved unsustainable, what led to the collapse, what a civilization must avoid if it wants to survive its own power. This last possibility is perhaps the most quietly urgent. We live in a civilization that has, within the span of a single human lifetime, developed the technological capacity to alter the climate of an entire planet, to release energies that could end most complex life on Earth, to manipulate the genetic foundations of biology in ways whose long-term consequences are not understood. We are, by almost any reasonable metric, the most powerful civilization in the history of our species. We are also, by several metrics, it's among the most fragile, dependent on intricate technological systems that could be disrupted by a sufficiently large solar flare, a sufficiently severe drought, a sufficiently determined adversary. We have built an extraordinary edifice on foundations we have never fully stress-tested. If the civilization that preceded us was similarly powerful, similarly fragile, and failed, collapsed catastrophically enough that most of its physical record was destroyed and only its most durable monuments survived, encoded with the knowledge it most needed to preserve, then the message in those monuments may not be purely retrospective. It may be a warning, a gift, a map, not just of what was, but of what might be, and what care it requires to survive. The pyramids have been standing on the plateau at Giza for approximately 4,500 years. They were built, if the theory is correct, from plans and specifications that were developed at least 6,000 years before that. They have outlasted every civilization that has known them. They will outlast us, unless something extraordinary intervenes. They will stand on that plateau for another 50,000 years, encoded with their mathematics and their alignments and their whispered history of a world that ended and a people who refused to let everything that mattered end with it. All they have ever asked of us is to stop and really look, not at the stones, at what the stones are saying, at the silence beneath the silence, where a civilization buried its most essential self in the faith that one day, the people would arise who were ready to listen. The question is whether we are that people. The question is whether we have, finally, the humility and the curiosity and the courage to look at those enormous stones and admit that we do not know everything they mean, and that not knowing and being willing to keep looking is the beginning of the kind of wisdom that keeps civilizations alive. The stones are waiting. They have always been waiting. They will wait for as long as it takes. That is precisely what they were built to do. And the night settles over the desert, and the stars wheel slowly overhead in their ancient patterns, and the Sphinx stares into the eastern horizon, where the sun will rise tomorrow, as it has risen 10,000 times since those monuments were raised. And the silence underneath everything deepens and deepens until it becomes something you can almost hear. Sleep now. Let the questions work in the dark. Some of the most important things we have ever learned, we learned in the space between one world and the next, in the hush between the old story ending and the new one beginning. The pyramids have always known that. They were built in exactly that space. And they are still, after all these ages, waiting for us to catch up.